The LSE Library has, as many of you know, a fantastic range of archives of peace activists and organisations which are all open to the public. This also includes the Greenham Common collection, which we'll be discussing today. The bios for our speakers you may have found on Eventbrite, so I'm not going to run through them here because we have limited time, but we have 4 wonderful speakers. We're going to open with Emma Pizarro and Silvia Gallotti, who are both qualified archivists with the LSE Library. And they're going to be talking about the Greenham Common collection in the library and the process of archival practice. They will be talking for about 10 minutes. This will then be followed by Kate Kerrow and Rebecca Morton, who led the Greenham Women Everywhere project, which involved interviewing the women who were part of the Greenham Common Peace Camp. They too will be speaking for about 10 minutes. At that point, we're then going to be opening up for questions and answers, and I hope you're going to be taking an active part in that process. Anyway, can I hand over the floor to Emma and Sylvia?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Silvia Gallotti, and I'm here today with my colleague Emma Pizarro. We are both qualified archivists and work at LSE Library in the Archives and Special Collections department. As Louise said, LSE Library holds several collections relating to peace campaigns, including the C&D archives, and archives relating to Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp, which is our focus of today. I'm going to look at how this material, the Greenham Common Peace Camp material, has made its way to the LSE archives, and what we as archivists have done to the material since it's arrived here, based on some of the guiding principles of archival practice. Then Emma is going to look at some of the issues relating to our role as archivists in selecting, describing, and making the material accessible. In other words, archiving memories. So why the LSE? The Greenham Common Peace Camp collections were originally deposited at the Women's Library by women involved in the camps as gifts to the library from 1983 onwards. The Women's Library began its life in 1926 to manage suffrage literature accumulated since the 1866 Women's Suffrage Petition, and it has grown ever since. It tells the story of the campaign for women's rights and women's equality. So it seems the perfect place for the Greenham Common Peace Camp material. The Women's Library is today at LSE, and it was transferred there in 2013. The collections include traditional material found in archives. We have a few examples here in the image on the slides. So we have correspondence, publications, publicity material, photographs, videos, but also we have some less traditional material found in archives, such as objects. For example, we have pin badges, we have a typewriter used by one of the women, we have a t-shirt worn by one of the women during a protest, and we even have some of the bolt cutters that were used to cut the fence around the Greenham Common camp base. So what have we done with the material since it's arrived at the library? So our role as archivists is to preserve the papers for the long term and to make it accessible to everyone. And to do this, we follow well-established principles. There are 2 main principles that underpin archival theory and practice: the principle of provenance and the principle of original order. Provenance means that material coming from the same source must be kept together as it was deposited to the archive. And original order means that the material must be kept in the order in which it was used and maintained by its creators. The purpose of these principles is to preserve contextual information about the creators, the records, the relationship between the records, but also to help us understand how the material was used and why it was created and why it was kept. So for example, if we found one of these images in the slides on its own or together with a lot of other images not related to them, we probably struggle to understand what is depicting, who are the people in it, what was the event and when it happened. But if it's found in a context with leaflets or press cuttings or diaries, we may be able to work out what the event was and who the people in it are. So this is why the context is very important for archivists and for researchers as well. So for all the, most of the Greenham Common collections, these principles were followed. So we have the context for all of them. And as we can see in this slide, on the left-hand side, there's a list of, from our catalogue of the main collections related to Greenham Common. So we have, for example, the Yellow Camp records, Janie and Juliet Nelson papers, the papers of Jill Truman, Lynn Barlow, Jeanette Leach, for example. And each one of these collections have been catalogued in order to make the material discoverable and accessible. And in other words, we have produced a list of the material that we make available online. And these catalogues have been created following international standards, which expect us to organize records in a fixed structure, which we call hierarchical structure, which personally I don't really like as a name. I prefer to call it family tree. And it's a bit like a file structure in a computer. And here we have the examples of the Yellow Camp collection. So we have the top level is the Yellow Camp collection, and then is divided into series, which are a group of records that belong together. So we have the court cases, correspondence, diaries, etc. And each of these series is then divided into subgroups and folders. So each court case, for example, is one folder, as you can see in the example. And following the standards also means describing the material, giving a certain type of information about the records, an amount of information. Here we see an example on the left-hand side, a series level, on the right-hand side at file level. And you see there's a title, there's a reference number, there's some dates, there's the extent, so how big the collection is, and there's a brief description of the content. So I've illustrated very briefly how we do things and what our guiding principles are. But these principles are by no means perfect, and sometimes they feel as too rigid and outdated, particularly considering the ever-evolving nature of collections, depositors, and technology. There are many issues that need to be considered when thinking about archival practice and archiving memories. And I'm now going to hand over to Emma, who's going to talk about some of these issues. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Sylvia. So I'm just going to share my screen first. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the parallels that are often drawn between archives and memory. So archives document transactions, and they provide evidence of the activities of nations, organisations, communities and individuals. And it's in this sense that archives are often referred to as society's collective memory. And without deliberate effort to record them, memories have a habit of fading or distorting. And the act of archiving serves as an exteriorization of memory. So in other words, it's a way for us to transfer memories from individual to collective, and a way to remember things outside of our human memory. And so if we're thinking of an archive as a memory bank into which we can all collectively dip to recall past events, then we must also acknowledge the power and control that archives have over what will be known about the past. And historically, records by or about women have been systematically excluded from archival holdings. And this is really an example of how society has privileged the memories of the powerful. So both memory and archives are selective, and they represent only fragments of what's happened in the past. Alongside evidence of transactions, archives can also capture the stories that form group identity and promote social cohesion within a community, which can help to sustain cultural traditions and values. So the archives belonging to peace and feminist groups reveal how these groups were formed, what ambitions they had, and the struggles they may have endured. In her book, The Archival Turn in Feminism, Kate Eichhorn suggests that feminist interest in archives is to make sense of the legacies, epistemes, and traumas pressing down on the present. By excluding notions of memory and identity from archival theory and practice, we're ignoring the role of archivists as active agents in shaping collective and historical memories. So when we appraise records, we're assessing their significance and anticipating their enduring value for future users. And in the process of deciding what we retain as a permanent record and what we discard, as well as in describing material for archives, catalogues and finding aids, we're essentially making decisions about what's worth remembering. And the professional assumption of the archivist as an impartial custodian is challenged by the notion that appraisal can be both an exercise of power by archivists in shaping social memory and an act of resistance by archivists against other powers that wish to shape social memory for their own purposes. In reality, archives are not neutral, and neither is archival practice. So the opportunity to engage with depositors to better understand the material that we're processing is something that's incredibly valuable for research, for archivists, and perhaps particularly so with the records of community groups and activists, where the material they've collected, it might not be organised in a way that we're used to, and it might not as easily fall into the kind of conventional categories defined by theory. It's important to remember that there's no one fixed meaning of any archival document. So we might know why a document was created, or something about the context in which it was used, which will tell us something about maybe why the record was preserved. But the power it has to trigger different memories will give the document other meanings, and this can be quite difficult to represent in an archive catalogue. So, for example, if we think again about the court case papers that Sylvia's mentioned, within a file there's an arrest record of a protester, and this document, on the face of it, provides evidence that an arrest took place. So it records information such as date, time, location, the stated offence. What it also provides evidence of indirectly is an example of the type of action that the campaigners are organising. It will spark memories of the protest itself, the action that led up to the arrest, and perhaps even recollections about the person involved. So traditional theory tells us that there should be just a single objective and authoritative voice in a catalogue. But allowing input from people who are directly involved with the activities which created the records can produce a much richer catalogue, one which provides a backstory, expands on content and context, and gives insight into the significance of certain records that would otherwise have been lost. And so to conclude, we'd just like to say that this is an incredibly rich area for discussion. We're aware that we've really only briefly touched on some of the ideas. There's many more questions that are worth exploring. And in particular, we're sorry not to have had time to go into some of the issues around depositing activist archives with institutional archives rather than independent community-led archives. So questions about who should have authority over how a community's experiences and memories are preserved and used. And so this last slide is just a list of resources that Sylvia and I have found useful in thinking about ideas around this. So if anyone is interested in some further reading, then I think our slides will be shared after the event. So thank you everyone for listening.
Would you like me to carry on? Oh, I can't.
Louise might be on.
Yeah, I think Louise is on mute.
I'm so sorry. I'm going to turn the floor to Kate and Rebecca. That's all I was saying. Sorry.
Thank you. So my name's Kate Kerrow, and I'm a writer and researcher. And last year I worked with Rebecca Morden, who runs Scary Little Girls, and we applied for a grant from the Heritage Lottery to basically begin a project which would collate what we hoped would be a large amount of oral testimonies of a good number of the Greenham women. We'd aimed for about 50 women, but one Greenham woman posted a Facebook notice to her friends, and we ended up with about 400 approaching us. So we had an overwhelming amount of women wanting to be included in the archive, which wasn't actually manageable within the confines of the project that we'd set up. So that in itself threw up some issues, which I'll talk a little bit about later. But the point of the archive was basically to record women's impressions, women's experiences. It was very much a project about memory. We were very much coming at it from the perspective of storytellers and artists. We wanted to step out of the process as much as was possible and let the women take control of their narratives. But to do that is very hard. You know, there are challenges to that, definitely. But what we were trying to do was step back as much as was possible. And one of the reasons we wanted to do that is because some of the women had talked to us about previous experiences they'd had with sharing their testimonies. And some talked about there being a very strong desire from project organisers or academics or whoever had come to them with this to talk about establishing facts and categorising and compartmentalising, establishing real solid information, which some had found very difficult to present, ideally, in the way that the context was presented to them. And as I suppose for us, this desire for structure around archiving is obviously hugely important, but we were in a slightly different position. We weren't archivists in quite the same way. So we were able to be a little bit led by some of the ways that the women at Greenham were working. So those women were championing very new ways of working. They were rejecting hierarchies, they were rejecting leaders, they were working laterally, and they were, each woman was her own individual leader, and they were coming together as a group to work as equals. And so we tried to be influenced by the women's approach in our archiving of their memories, basically. So rather than trying to establish set facts and paint a structured, definite picture of life at Greenham, ironing out the cloudy bits, pulling threads together, we had to accept that memories were going to challenge one another. We didn't realise how much, but they really did. And we have to remember that thousands of women visited Greenham across a 20-year history, and the shape of the camp was continuously in evolution. So conflicting pieces of information about timelines of who was there when, what happened when, were prevalent. One of the really big things that came up is, I think it's generally accepted that the camp became women only in February 1982. But we really struggled to get that information from the women. There were huge amounts of conflict about that point of view. And what we came to realise is that perhaps that was a process of becoming women only rather than an event in and of itself, because there were so many contrasting memories of it. It was even difficult to actually establish a true map of the camp on set dates from our memory archive, because so many accounts throw up different information. One woman remembered the camp in one way, another completely differently. So we have to throw, you know, that it does become very difficult to establish truth and fact. Well, not truth actually, but fact, I suppose. The interesting thing about our archive was that no woman actually said she was right above any other woman, only that she could only recollect her own memories, and all of the memories were important because they offered some new piece of the stories. It was a remarkably freeing experience actually to accept the wild, curvy path that memory throws up, and accepting that the picture of history isn't always tangible and definite. We did have this problem of acting as curators. and presenting an archive of memories that we were drawn to, because a lot of the women sent us their stories over email first of all, and we were selecting, and that was unavoidable to a degree. To cope with that, we tried to mix the gates, we tried to mix the years, the subject matters, the women's ages, both when they were at camp and when they were giving the interview, their backgrounds, their geographical locations. But it is always unavoidable to have some subjectivity. We selected a team of volunteers as well to help us choose and select the women. And our team of volunteers ranged from the ages of 18 to 80 and also came from a variety of backgrounds. So we tried there to, you know, open that up too. And our interviews were deliberately long and winding. So they ran until the woman had run out of stuff to say. The interviewers did have prepared questions, but they prepared them themselves. We felt, and they took them on tangents, and the conversation was very much a sort of, you felt very much in the archive that a conversation that was between one interviewer and a Greenham woman would be completely different with a different interviewer. And so they were not just memories, but also what that interviewer and that woman brought out of each other at that particular moment as well. We actually used a lot of photo material from the wonderful LSE archive for memory stimulation, and the women were really overwhelmed by that. It was an enormously effective a tool for us. Our editing process was very minimal. We only cut out coughs and sneezes and toilet trips. We also cut out anything that the woman had later regretted saying publicly, so we cut out that, obviously. But we deliberately stepped back from that too. As a result, the archive is, I suppose, is winding and a little kind of messy and organic and authentic, and you can listen for a while and be on a tangent about, you know, something completely different that a Greenham woman was inspired by, and really those people, they come to life in them. And I think memory archives really pose more questions than they answer in some ways. It is possible to collate patterns and threads and you know, establish some facts, but really our archive was about recognizing not just the women themselves, but also this beautiful version of history which isn't necessarily tangible or definite, and instead is kind of strange and winding and a bit unreliable sometimes, but is a rather beautiful insight into what was very much a lateral campaign. I think that probably just about covers it for me. Becca, did you want to follow on?
Rebecca?
You happy for me to go straight in?
Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, that's what happened. That's what we did. So I'm going to chat to you now a little bit about what we're sort of doing with the archive now, as well as working with LSE, so that it is actually, so it's archived by some proper archivists with some proper structure, which sounded really good in that first talk. I was like, oh yeah, we're just not doing that at all. Because actually, in a way, we've sort of even more, I think, in a way, thrown out the rule book of what happens next. Compared to perhaps what an archivist would do, although I'm very glad you're doing what you do your way, because I've appreciated researching in that archive. What we're doing now is we're trying to get these memories that we have archived to as many people as possible. So like Kate says, having tried to be as broad and lateral as possible, so that wherever you're looking for yourself in those stories, you would find you somewhere in that archive. You'd find someone who spoke to you and of you. We're now trying to make sure that we get that people get the chance to actually know the archive exists and come and look at it and listen to it, because apart from anything else, everything that you were saying, Emma, about who gets to decide what gets archived is basically, it's such a huge deal, especially something like Greenham, which radicalised, you know, thousands of women. And you just know if men had done it, it would be very famous. And actually everyone who I speak to who's younger than me, which is, I'm 44, so everyone younger than 40, doesn't really know about it or has never even heard of it, which is just the most appalling cultural robbery. So, we're looking at, so now what we're doing, I suppose, is almost looking at what can be invented from memory, what can be inspired by memory, and what permission we can give younger women as well as intergenerational women from memory. And particularly, I'm really inspired by the memories that the Greenham women donated to us. So what we're doing at the moment, what we've been doing over lockdown. We were very fortunate just before lockdown. We got another Heritage Lottery grant, who were the people that had funded our first collection of interviews, but this time to share the archive. And so we're now looking at working with Falmouth University with their gaming and animation department, and looking at whether we can make feminist collaborative video games about Greenham that would be student led, but would obviously reach a completely different audience. And we're very open for them to make whatever we think that Greenham lends itself to all kinds of different gaming ideas, but they've got, our only rules is it's got to be feminist, it's got to be feminist centric, female centric, and it's got to be cooperative rather than combative. So we think that's going to be really interesting. We've had a little piece of software made that we're looking to help other women learn to use and put together in groups, which turns sets of the testimonies into almost a choose your own adventure story, which is like a campfire of different interviewees, and you can read it but you follow it, and it's a beautiful thing that brings together some sound and illustration as well. And we're hopefully teaching that to intergenerational groups of women so they learn tech and digital skills themselves. And the really big thing that we've been doing over lockdown with all this is we've been making an online exhibition, because of course we were going to tour an exhibition and hopefully expand on an exhibition this year. So but that obviously, you know, that was the before times. So now here we all are. And so we're working with a tech co-op. So again, very Greenham centric. It's all being hosted on environmentally sourced and run web host and everything, so it's environmentally friendly. It's the lead designer is a woman, which is very hard to find in tech as well, so it's really exciting. And they're basically making us an online exhibition that has 3 3D spaces and a lot of 2D exhibition space. And what we've done is bring together Greenham women who we knew from the archive were artists, and invite other Greenham women who might be artists or actors as well, to voice, write and perform work. And then also a collection of younger artists who we knew were actively feminist, to create response about Greenham, so writing their own original songs or their own original scenes or whatever, or paintings, all inspired by the memories of Greenham. So either if they hadn't heard of it or it was new to them, we were giving them the archive to listen to, or of course if there were women who'd been there, they were making work, and perhaps they were giving us scenes from their play that they'd written about Greenham and things like that. And then we were rehearsing them over Zoom, recording them, and now it'll be a land that you can hopefully explore and find. You know, you click on objects and sound files pop up, or you go to a 2D area and there's a whole lot of information about a particular gate that you might not have heard of. Woad. I hadn't heard of Woad until like 2 weeks ago, and I've been getting this. So I'm desperate to know, and maybe Rebecca Johnson can tell me, because I can see she's here. It's very intimidating to talk in front of you, Rebecca. I'm going to sing in front of you in a minute as well. But is there a difference between turquoise and Woad? Are they 2 distinct gates? I need to know. I'm overrunning my time, so I'll quickly finish by saying I'm going to just sing you, as an example of what we've been doing, I'm going to sing you a song on my ukulele here. And this is a song that basically comes up in our interviews all the time, and I think it's a really interesting way to finish off talking about memory, because basically people who visited the gates, it's used a lot in demonstrations, the song. And so if you're a visitor, you remember it as this time of unity, or you faced up to things with your sisters. And so lots of the people in our archive was like, oh my God, and just remember we all sat there and sang that Linking Arms and whatever. And then other women that perhaps lived at camp listen to this song and go, oh my God, it's this song again. And of course it's She's Like a Mountain, She Lives On and On. And some of the women in the archive, as I say, are hugely moved by it, and some of them go, oh, she does go on and on though, doesn't she? And it's a really funny mixture when you hear them all talk about it. But we've had a lovely version of it done. I'm going to do a very simple version of it for you, but you can find it on the website as well. So here you go. Nobody can push back an ocean. It's gonna rise back up in waves. And nobody can stop the wind from blowing, can stop a mind from growing. And somebody may stop my voice from singing, but the song will live on and on. You can't kill the spirit. She's like a mountain, old and strong. She lives on and on. Nobody can stop a woman from feeling. She has to rise up like the sun. And somebody may change the words we're saying, but the truth will live on and on. You can't kill the spirit. She's like a mountain, old and strong. She lives on and on. There you go.
Rebecca, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. Oh, wow. I feel like we should end on that. Maybe we'll come back to you again. So, wow. You know, before I open up the conversation, I'm so sorry, we've got another 25 minutes, I think, to the audience. I wonder whether we should take this opportunity to have, you know, a little bit of an exchange between Sylvia, Emma, and Kate and Rebecca. And the reason why I say this is it seems to me that when I was listening to, you know, Sylvia and Emma speak about the work of an archivist, you know, you have these principles, these international principles that you adhere to in your work about provenance, about order, about, you know, and they are demanding principles. And yet when I hear what Kate and Rebecca have been doing, you know, Kate, I think it was you who said messy, you know, and Rebecca, you know, your whole approach to understanding, you know, sort of what happened then and trying to record and to relive and to document what happened in that period is, you know, you can do it through song. And it seems to me that it was through song, but it was through song rather than any other medium that you chose to express the memories of those women. And I think that's a really important point that you're making. You know, Sylvia, Emma, how do you feel about what it is that Kate and Rebecca are doing to this material and with this material?
Yeah, I think it's fantastic. I think it's really exciting. And I think sometimes with kind of traditional archival theory, you're taught these principles, and whilst it's very important to aspire to certain standards and international standards, you also have to think about, you know, the groups themselves, the community that you're trying to represent in the collections, and allowing them also to have some autonomy in how they self-identify and the things that are important to them and how they would like to frame their experiences. And they don't always fit into what we traditionally have been taught as archivists, you know, the categories that they should be fitted into. And it's things like, you know, song, and also Sylvia mentioned the bolt cutters that are in Jeanette Leach's papers, and that's a good example. I mean, it's an object, and it's not one you really find in many collections, but that it's a byproduct of an activity, but also represents so many other memories for the women who were involved in the activity that item represents. So,
yeah, I think what Rebecca and Kate talked about, it sort of shows what a collaboration between archivists and the community that create the archives can do, really. Because if we could put all these together, it would be perfect, because we have both sides of the coin, really. So, I mean, I think what you're doing is fantastic, and I think as archivists we'll love to do certain things that you're doing. So when we approach these collections, most of the time we start by knowing nothing about it at all, which can be good because then we are less biased. So we try to be objective, but at the same time we might be missing out so much which you could contribute to. So I think a collaboration it's in the ideal world, that would be the best way to do it.
It very much feels like a collaboration, because the LSE archive was just so crucial to our early research, and we really sat in that archive for a couple of days. I think Daniel just kind of let us sit in there, and we took so many pictures, and we were really very led by our own sort of imaginations, and it was just one of the most important starts to this project, really. And I suppose in a way we picked out things from that archive and we took them to certain women, and that in itself, I guess, was creative. But how special those objects were that when those women looked at them. So, for example, the bolt cutters, the picture of the bolt cutters, just so many different stories came out of that. But one of my favourites was that there were just no bolt cutters left in Newbury at one point. Like, if you were a workman trying to get, something done in Newbury with a bolt cutter, there was just no chance in hell that you ever could. And so just the stories that came from those objects were just amazing. So I think, in a way, it is already collaborative. But yeah, there's always room to take that further, isn't there?
Yeah. Yeah, because I think it's important to say as well that even though the archives have come to us, I strongly believe they will still belong to the women who deposited them.
Yeah.
So physically they may be with us, but intellectually they belong to whoever created them, used them.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I wanted to just back up that Kate's point is I totally feel like that the world needs both of our approaches. It really, really, really does. And also, I love performing in libraries. If we can, do more together, I'm really up for that.
Noise in libraries.
Yes.
We play well with others. We like collaborating. So if this sparks ideas, we'd love to talk about that.
So I just want to abuse my prerogative here and to sort of probe a couple of things that have come up, and sometimes you've changed your language or corrected yourself, and the two words that keep on coming up are fact and memory. Okay, and to a certain extent, you've all said memories change over time, they're unreliable, they're partial, etc. And so historical records obviously, sort of reflect that. Of course, in this context, they're gendered as well. But then, there's also this notion of wanting to capture the facts, because the facts are really important. And especially in this day and age, sort of the facts, what are they? Okay. And that was not, don't take me seriously on that last point, but okay, I just want to sort of probe your understanding here of sort of how do you try to bridge that the fact with the changing memory, whether Rebecca and Kate in your engagement with your material, or even Sylvia and Emma how do you decipher and recognize or make that judgment between, hey, this is, we understand that this is about a changing memory, but what are the facts?
Can I just say, I think the reason that me and Kate check ourselves, I don't want to speak for you, Kate, so do chime in if I'm getting this wrong, but the reason we think we check ourselves around fact is because so many of the women's interviews contradict each other. And who are we to say, well, that one is fact and that one is just memory? And it feels almost like a sort of hierarchical use of language, also placing, of course, fact as objective and memory as subjective, as if one or the other is bad or better, as if facts can never be truly objective and memory, so on and so on. So I think we're really kind of careful about that in our own approach to the value we place on each individual testimony. And I think also there's something about having a lot of different, that was part of the reason that drove us to try and be so broad and so eclectic in the different women that we tried to include, and that we've now got more funding to keep going and keep including and keep the memory pool diverse, because to us it is all facts. They're each one as valid as another, and if they don't agree, that doesn't mean one of them is right or wrong necessarily. It might just mean that they remember things differently, or that they experience them differently, or that things can be more than one thing at a time. And that's actually really important learning in itself, isn't it? That there is no black and white, really. Lots of things can be true at the same time. I think that's almost more important than fact for me, I think, in a way.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see how the documents, the papers relate to all the interviews and the memories. Because in theory, the documents will give you the fact. But sometimes it does happen that they contradict themselves. But not so much. And we, as archivists, we try to stick to the facts as much as possible, because this is where we need to be very objective and try not to put our own input into the memory.
And I suppose there are facts. I mean, certain blockades happened on certain dates and certain people went to court, and there are records of those facts. And I think there are, substantial, what we might deem reliable records to ascertain certain events happened. But I suppose it's our archive is more concerned with what happened in the courtroom, I guess, or what was the emotional response to being held in a cell. And I suppose that is, in a sense, I guess, true as well. But it's true, truth and fact. It's what our archives are concerned with, and I suppose the different. And as Becca says, both are absolutely crucial in getting any kind of picture, because it is important to know when an event occurred and how many police were there and all that kind of stuff. But I suppose it's just about getting information from reliable sources as well, because all the reports quite often were considered very mixed by the Greenham women in terms of their reliability of events as well. So
I think it's really important to sort of just follow on from that. You're just thinking as you're talking there, Kate, that just as you were saying, lovely archivists, about it, you do have there is a power in what gets archived. There's also a power in what gets decided as fact. Because if you've got, for the example that Kate gave earlier about when it becomes a women-only camp, like now we just know it as this very famous, the most famous women-only led action since suffrage. But at the time, we have women in the archive, who lived at Greenham for years and are sure that it was within a couple of days of them arriving, a couple of weeks at the most, they were having big meetings about making, and the decision was made, and she was being told to come back to vote on the decision, to make it women only. But then there are other women in the archive who are talking about having boyfriends there or whatever for months afterwards. So you can't say one of them is the facts. It's kind of both. They probably did have those meetings, and they probably did decide one thing in one meeting, and then maybe they decided differently in another, and then and it's about when something becomes something we're all doing, rather than when it becomes a fact. And I suppose that's another thing we had to represent, because the other thing that you're working towards lived experience, and they argue with you, as they should. Women quite rightly get in touch with me regularly and tell me off about stuff if I get it wrong.
We got told off a lot, didn't we?
Or say, I'm worried you're saying this, and we'll say, oh, that person says that in that interview, but actually all these people say this, and they go, oh, okay. Or whatever, or don't just. We started a mutual aid society during lockdown for the Greenham women to entertain them, to pick things to entertain themselves, and we got into trouble with some women for doing what we called sing-alongs that had been requested by the women on the list, and we had to then say, no, we're not saying your work is frivolous and that you didn't do enormous, powerful and damaging things that damaged you in your mental health and your physical health. You took huge risks for us, but some of you in our mutual aid society asked us to run a sing-along, and so that's and then they go, oh, okay, that sounds fun. But so there is it's your life, and you're right to be corrected if someone misinterprets your entire life, especially when you had a very impactful life.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think as well there's kind of parallels running along here as well with the I mean, we talked a lot about how archivists have this kind of power control over kind of deciding what's going to be remembered when we appraise records and when we describe material. But also before the records even get to us, I mean, there's a selection process that goes on naturally for human beings in what they select, say, as their memories, what they recall about events. So as you say, I mean, it's happening constantly, what we retain and what we discard, because archives don't physically have space to retain all the records we're given, and also that your human memory doesn't retain every lived experience. So there's parallels between archiving and memory. So yeah.
So I'm going to jump in here to say that I've been looking at the chat, and there's a lot of chat going on, a lot of exchanges, etc. I can't see any questions, and I think the interesting thing about that is that people are here to find out about the projects that you've been involved in, and I suspect that a lot of people who've joined us today were actually at Greenham too. So they're interested in the process that you've been through, about, you know, sort of documenting their memories, their lives. In fact, I can see Rebecca. Rebecca, can I invite you to, you know, say something to us here? You know, I mean, like, you were there, you were very active, still are. Are you looking for your mute control? Yes, there we go. Hello.
Well, I'm here as a long-time Yellowgator, as we called ourselves until the wages for housework attacks, because we didn't want to just be the main gate, because that had become very sort of focused around the one gate that was there at the very beginning. But I'm also here with a blue gator, Hina. So, yeah. I mean, there are so many memories, but what, can I just say, one of the things that I absolutely love about Rebecca and Kate's project is that recognition that Greenham women are everywhere, were everywhere, and are everywhere. And what, you know, I mean, I'm somebody that my name has cropped up in quite a lot of stuff over the time because of particular roles, and because I was there for 5 years. But the fact is that I've actually refused to write a memoir or anything, precisely because I didn't want my memoir to get, you know, I possibly might one day, now that there's a lot more out there of memoirs, of women writing memoirs, but what your project does is actually bring to life how many experiences living at Greenham and, you know, frequently visiting Greenham and organizing actions and taking actions back to their own home countries. And somebody just mentioned the feminist camp in Canada, and, you know, all of that. These were all part of Greenham Women Everywhere. And we struggled against the media constantly, trying to make it about, you know, leaders. And I suffered from that, because after I was the spokeswoman, after I'd come out of prison, and I was one of the 15 women that organized Embrace the Base. And so I took on a role to talk to the media on that particular occasion. And suddenly the media only wanted to talk to me, which was rubbish. And I actually had to get to a stage of, I felt kind of almost hounded, of refusing to speak to the media, which is also rubbish, because actually we just needed to all those who wanted to continue to do that. So what your archive is doing, which I love, is actually giving expression in their own voices to so many women who are part of Greenham in so many different kinds of ways. And I wish you'd actually had the resources to do the 400. Because there were 4,000, 40,000, you know, and all of those are the Greenham stories. We wouldn't have Greenham without that. And somebody like me, I would never have gone to Greenham while it was still mixed. You know, had enough of that kind of patriarch, you know, in C&D and you know, all that. So it was that decision, that was a decision taken in February of 1982, and I don't think men stayed after that. But was obviously a decision that followed a process. You know, we've had Lucy say, well, her dad stayed at Greenham for quite a while. And clearly that was the case with some of the women in that early stage. And then there were some problems. I wasn't there then, so I can't speak about who took that decision and why. I only know that a lot of women like me, who were feminist peace activists, started coming to Greenham to support Greenham at a time when they were about to be evicted, you know, for a really big eviction, and got rid of, to show that women could do this and would stay. And without that decision, I think Greenham would have gone the way of most of the mixed peace camps. Because remember, there were loads of mixed peace camps over the period sort of 83, 84. But I don't want to take this much time, because I have one set of experiences, but I joined this, and with Hina, my partner, and we didn't get together at Greenham. We got together many, many years later at an Aldermaston cocktail party, actually, of the Aldermaston camp, which still exists as a women's peace camp, once every month, for one weekend every month. But the point is, I think the only way that Greenham can be understood is through that multiple layering of expressions of Greenham Women Everywhere that Kate and Rebecca actually got. You were the first people that really got it, and I love you for that.
That's made my life. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Made my life too. Thank you, Rebecca. It's really interesting to think. When you were talking, I was just thinking about how many different political opinions the women had who spoke to us, and just I find that absolutely amazing that there were just so many conflicting opinions, actually, and you all lived together and worked and strived for this thing, and yet there was just so much disagreement. I mean, it's amazing that it just didn't break out into more sort of problems than there ever were. I mean, it's just, and I do feel that's testament to the women-only lateral way of working.
There were those kind of periods, but it's true that the only time that it actually resulted in a split was when there was a concerted effort to try to take control of what Greenham meant, or what being a Greenham woman could be, and take away that Greenham Women Everywhere kind of understanding. But it used to annoy the hell out of me when people would say, and it was mostly men, but not always, when I go around speaking and raising money and bringing it back and this sort of thing, and they'd go, oh, it must be so much easier to be a women's peace camp. And I go, it is not all sweetness and light. We are constantly discussing and arguing through really quite serious political differences. Quite a lot of women were anarchists. Quite a lot of women were more, were feminists, or came from a kind of socialist or Labour, or, all of those kinds of aspects. And some women really just kind of saw it as a camp for having fun in summer and taking lots of drugs, which other women found a real problem with. And, there were all of these things that actually had to be navigated and argued about. And we started off by having a decision that, we all had to discuss and agree collectively, and with a kind of Quaker process of consensus, every action that would take place. And by 83, that just wasn't possible. It just wasn't feasible. So we then backed off a little bit and said, okay, as long as it's a women-only action, as long as it's completely non-violent, groups of women can do any action as Greenham women, either in their own localities or bases or facilities near them, or you can plan it and bring it down to Greenham. And that's what groups of women started doing. Manchester Women, London Women did a whole week from 4th to 8th of July of completely blockading the whole base. And it was almost entirely the London women's groups that held that together. Those of us living at camp were part of it. Once we'd done that, it was like Greenham blossomed. And yet, some things kind of didn't go so well, but that was all part of it too, and part of learning it, and part of owning our responsibility.
Thank you, Rebecca. Do you know what? I've now looked at the time. You're so captivating, some of these stories and your memories, that I have lost track of time, and we've only actually got 2 minutes. And now I have a couple of questions that have come in. These are really to Kate and Rebecca. The first one is, through the interview process, we now know a lot about what happened at Greenham, perhaps, but what is it? What is the one thing that you take from this? What is the one thing that you learned through this whole process that was new to you? That I don't know whether Kate, you want to, or Rebecca, you want to take the lead in this?
Do you mean in terms of archivism or life?
in terms of your project, in terms of the project itself.
Yeah. I really do feel it's that. Like we're working on a book of this project at the moment, and so I'm surrounded by the books and the research and the testimonies all the time, and I genuinely feel like the thing that I've learned is about who, almost quite personal to me in a way, in that there's just new ways of doing things all the time. That sisterhood is so important, you know. Surrounding yourself by people who are inspiring and who there is always a solution to a problem, you know. Be brave, you know. Those are they feel very personal lessons in terms of, and I think that is very much the business of a storyteller and a writer, which is what I am, I suppose, rather than an archivist. And I think you're probably asking me about what I've learned about archivists. but I do feel it's very hard not to learn about who you are as an individual and how you want to contribute when you're dealing with this kind of material, I suppose.
Archivists are people too, so probably like
it's true. Are people too.
I think the thing I just speaking, I suppose, with my hat on of being the sort of trying to get this work to the next audiences and the next generations. The thing that I've learnt to my utter joy is how hungry women are to hear about this. I've done work with sort of students and at universities, but I've also done work right down in primary schools talking about it. And all of the people, I mean, young people and all women and girls are just like, what? Tell me everything. And it's so fantastic. And if you want to know more, to shamelessly plug in before I hand it, sorry, Kate, we are presenting some of that material that's been so inspiring, either by Greenham Women or about them, and largely based on their memories, this Saturday at a campfire event that you can find on our Scary Little Girls website. And you'll see the way that so many people have taken this testimony and written songs about it, or, you know, and kind of gone, oh my God, I want to make this out of it, which might be nice for you. Sorry, Kate, you can.
And I was going to say, I think that's what it is really. I think it's that what women are hungry about is finding their place in the world and how to contribute to it. And I think learning what it is to be in a sisterhood is so much what's coming out of this material. And I think that's what is inspiring really to those women, and learning how to pave their own way in the world. And whatever age you're at, you know, it's possible to do that in a different way, isn't it? So
yeah, to be that positive change in the world. There was one woman who said to me, and it wasn't even as part of the interview, I'm hoping, because we are still building the interview process, just to assure you that we're trying not to lose voices, we're trying to keep them coming in. But one woman just said to me, she stood one day in the mud looking at women post an eviction, getting out their stuff again, remaking their benders, like starting to put the kettle on, starting to remake the fire, decided to make a vegan stew. And she just looked at it all. And it was the third eviction of the day or something, and it was raining. And she just thought, oh my God, we don't need men at all. Women can do anything. If we can do this, which we are, we can do absolutely anything. And I just thought, if you don't want women to know that, then you don't want them to know about Greenham, and that's why I think it's really important that you know about Greenham.
Yeah,
I think that is the perfect point at which we should draw this meeting to a close. So thank you, Sylvia. Thank you, Emma, Kate, and Rebecca. Would you all join me in thanking our speakers today? I think I'm probably going to be, yay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you, everyone. See you at the next event. Bye.